Good morning, church family. So good to see you this morning. Hey, if you are new with us, we're especially glad that you are here today. My name is John. Glad you are here this morning. We are in a series walking through the book of Acts in the New Testament. So if you got a Bible with you, Mark, the book of Mark in the New Testament. If you've got a Bible with you, Mark chapter 6 is where we're going to be picking it up today. If you don't have a Bible with you or aren't really sure about the Bible, you're kind of new to the Bible, don't know where to find that, don't worry. We'll have the verses on the screens here, and you can just look at those and follow along with us that way. Back a few months ago, I was visiting somebody in one of the hospitals down in the medical center. And as I was leaving, I kind of got lost. I got turned around. Somehow I ended up down on like the basement floor of the hospital. It's one of these huge hospitals. And so there's not like signage in the basement, so I don't know where I'm going. I'm just like aimlessly walking around all these hallways that look the same, just trying to find my way outside. So at one point, I'm walking down this long hallway, and then at the other end of the hallway, I see there's kind of this like small entourage of people. There's a police officer, and then in the middle of the entourage, there's just like a gigantic human being. So again, it's like pretty far away. So I'm like, that's odd, like an entourage, like huge dude. I'm like, I wonder if that's like somebody famous or someone notable something. Again, he's massive. So I'm like, is that maybe like Laremy Tunsil or like one of the other offensive linemen on the Texans? Like, who is that somebody? And so keep walking, they keep walking towards me, I keep walking towards them, and we get a little bit closer, and then I'm like, no, that's not Laremy Tunsil, that's not an offensive lineman. Like, I think I know who that person is. That person looks really familiar. I think I've seen them before, but we're still a little ways away, and even though I have glasses, I think my prescription like needs some updating. I still can't even see that well, even with glasses, so I'm like, no, that's definitely somebody. They definitely look familiar, but not really sure who that is yet. And then finally, we keep getting closer and closer, and we get to about like 5 feet away from one another. And I'm like, oh my goodness, that's Shaq. Like Shaq, the Diesel, is like right in front of me, and he's massive, right? Like I was losing my mind because one, it's Shaq. Shaq is like top 5 basketball players of all time, right? Just a living legend. And beyond that, I grew up in Central Florida, so I'm a lifelong Orlando Magic fan. We drafted Shaq. He is an icon, right? So I'm seeing Shaq like right in front of me, and I'm just like losing my mind. Like, this is crazy. I just walked by Shaq in the basement of a random hospital. This is awesome. But that experience, right, of where at first I saw him from far away, and I'm like, hey, like, that guy, there's something there. He got entourage. It's a huge dude. Like, I wonder if that's somebody famous or someone notable. So then you get a little closer, and then you can see a little bit more clear. Like, nope, yeah, it looks familiar. That's definitely somebody. Can't put my finger on it yet, but that's definitely somebody. To then finally getting face to face and saying, oh my goodness, that's Shaq. Right? That trajectory, that's kind of the same trajectory that Mark has taken us on as readers so far when it comes to us seeing Jesus. Mark starts off, and we kind of see Jesus and his identity at a distance. And so what happens is Mark starts off, he tells us that Jesus does some miracles. He heals some blind people. He casts some demons out of people. He does some miraculous things, but it kind of causes us to say, okay, that's unique. That's different. There's something there. Maybe there's something special about this Jesus fellow. Maybe he's somebody. And then recently in Mark, he's kind of gotten us a little bit closer, given us a little bit more clear of a picture of Jesus, and he's shown us some kind of even more outlandish miracles that Jesus has done, right? Because those first miracles that Mark records, healing of the blind and those things, they're miracles. All miracles are supernatural. But if you wanted to be a skeptic, right, if you wanted to be really cynical, you could say, oh, well, he healed a blind man. Maybe Jesus just had some medical information that was ahead of its time. That's not what's happening. It was a miracle. But if you want to be cynical, right, if you want to be a skeptic, you can kind of write those things off in some sort of ways. But what Mark has done lately is he has shown us truly undeniable supernatural miracles that Jesus has done. As we've gotten closer to seeing who Jesus really is, Mark has shown us that at one time Jesus just speaks, and with his words, he controls the weather. Right, a few weeks ago, Mark showed us this story where Jesus used his words to bring a dead girl back to life. So as Mark's kind of been bringing us closer to Jesus and the identity of Jesus, now we're seeing these supernatural miracles where it's like, okay, at first, when I first saw a glimpse, I was like, maybe something was up with this guy, but now it's like, okay, yeah, there's definitely something there. He's definitely somebody. There's definitely something more to him than just like another prophet or another teacher or another religious leader. But what's going to happen in Mark chapter 6 today is that moment where Mark basically puts us face to face with the identity of Jesus. He's kind of been giving some clues. He's been kind of pulling us in, giving us hints of who Jesus is. But in this passage today, he clearly lays out and shows us face to face Jesus' actual identity. Now, before we get to Mark 6, this story we're going to look at, it is steeped in all sorts of Old Testament history that the disciples of Jesus who are involved in the story, the disciples, they would have been familiar with these Old Testament stories, but for us today, some of us may not be familiar with them. So I want to kind of recap a few stories from the Old Testament real quick, because as we read Mark 6 basically contains all sorts of hyperlinks back to these stories in the Old Testament. Okay, so all these stories we're about to look at real quick, they all revolve around God revealing himself to humanity. All right, so just kind of get that in your mind for a second. These stories we're going to look at, they all have to do with God choosing to show himself, to reveal his glory to people. All right, so the first story takes place around 1400 BC, 1400 years or so before the birth of Jesus. And what's going on is the Hebrew people, they have been enslaved in Egypt for over 400 years now. For 400 years, they're slaves in Egypt, but God finally comes and God says, I'm going to rescue these people. I'm going to free them from their slavery in Egypt. So to do that, God first speaks to this guy named Moses, and he speaks to him through a burning bush. It's a crazy story. But what happens is Moses is out in the wilderness. He's kind of tending to some sheep. He's a shepherd. He's minding his own business, and he sees this bush that is on fire. It's flaming, but the flames are not consuming the bush. He's like, that's crazy. I've never seen that before. So he walks up to the burning bush, and God begins speaking to Moses through the bush. And God says, hey, Moses, the Hebrew people, they've been enslaved for 400 years. I'm going to rescue them and set them free, but congratulations, I'm going to use you to do it. I'm going to send you to Pharaoh. You're going to demand the release of the captives. Pharaoh will oblige. At first, he'll say no a couple times, but don't worry, I've got a plan. I'll take care of it. Eventually, he will give in, and he will let them go, and you're going to lead them into freedom. So at first, when God tells Moses this, Moses is skeptical. He doesn't think he's up to the job. He thinks that's kind of above his pay grade. He doesn't have the confidence to go and do this. So he's kind of negotiating with God. He's trying to talk his way out of it. And during that conversation, at one point, Moses says, okay, God, well, before I go to Pharaoh, when I go to the Hebrew people first, and I go and say, hey guys, I'm Moses, I'm here to set you free. God sent me to lead you out of captivity in Egypt. When I tell them that you sent me, God, if they say, God sent you, what God sent you? Which God are we talking about? You know, what is the name of the God that sent you? Moses says, God, what should I tell him? Moses is basically asking God, God, what is your name? What is the name that I should tell people the God that sent me? And so Exodus chapter 3, we'll have it up on the screen, but this is what it says. Exodus chapter 3, verse 14, Moses asked for God's name, and this is what it says. God replied to Moses, I am who I am. Say to the people of Israel, I am has sent you. Moses says, God, what is your name? God says, I am who I am. It's like the most boss move ever, right? Right? You know, today, like, you know, kind of the lingo people say, if somebody's like the best at something, you know how they say, oh, he is him. You've heard that, right? You know, so like Steph Curry, right? Double teamed yesterday, the end of the gold medal game, like double team, like step back, hits a crazy three-pointer to seal the game and win the gold for the U.S. Like, that's what you say. Like, Steph Curry is him. He is him. Right? That's what people say now. God was saying that about himself thousands of years ago. Right? Moses says, God, what is your name? God says, I am. To which I'm sure Moses is like, cool, God. I understand, like, I hear you, I got that, but like, no, what's your actual name? And God says, I am. Just so hardcore, right? But when Moses asks God his name, God says, I am. There you go. That's my name. So the next story, it's not too long after that. God has used Moses to free the people from slavery in Egypt. They're now out in the wilderness journeying to their new home. And in Exodus chapter 33, Moses has another encounter with God. But this time, in this encounter with God, Moses says to God, hey, God, like, I want you to reveal your glory to me, which is a pretty incredible thing for Moses to ask. Moses is basically saying, God, I want to see you with my eyes. I've heard you with my ears. I've seen you work through all these different miracles. But God, I want to actually physically see you in your presence. I want you to show me your glory. He wants to physically see God. Okay, and this is what it says. Again, it'll be here on the screen, Exodus 33:19. It said, the Lord replied, I will make all my goodness pass before you. Take note of that. Keep that in your mind. I will make all my goodness pass before you, and I will call out my name Yahweh before you. I will show mercy to anyone I choose, and I will show compassion to anyone I choose. But you may not look directly at my face, for no one may see me and live. The Lord continued, look, stand near me on this rock, and as my glorious presence passes by, there it is again, as my glorious presence passes by, I will hide you in the crevice of the rock and cover you with my hand until I have what? Passed by. Until I have passed by. Then I will remove my hand and I will let you see me from behind, but my face will not be seen. God is basically saying to Moses here, God's saying, hey Moses, that's cute that you want to see me. That's neat that you want to see my physical presence, but here's the deal, Moses. You can't see me and live. It's basically God saying, Moses, I am too glorious, I am too holy for you to even comprehend. If you were to truly behold my glory in the state of humanity that you are in right now, if you saw my glory and my holiness with your eyes, your heart would just explode and you would die. And God said, Moses, I don't want that to happen. I don't want to kill you, so let's do something else. God says, I'm going to hide you behind a rock, close your eyes, and I'm going to pass by you. And then once I've passed by, I'll tell you, open up, you can open your eyes, and then you can get a glimpse of me from behind. And so that's what happens. And by the way, this is crazy. It tells us after this, Moses just gets a glimpse of God from behind. And then when Moses comes down from the mountain, his face is shining for weeks. Crazy stuff. But that's what happens. Moses says, God, I want to see you. God, reveal yourself to me. And God says, you can't fully behold me, but I'll pass by and you can get a glimpse. All right, next story. It's about 900 BC. Now there's a prophet in Israel named Elijah. God has used this guy Elijah to do incredible things, to do incredible miracles. But at this point, things are not going well for Elijah. The queen, a woman named Jezebel, has put a bounty out on his head. People are hunting him, trying to have him killed. And Elijah's depressed. Elijah's dejected. Elijah wants to give up. And so God is going to reveal himself to Elijah, to speak to Elijah, to encourage Elijah. But I want us to see in 1 Kings chapter 19 how it happens that God reveals himself to Elijah. 1 Kings 19:11. God says, go out and stand before me on the mountain, the Lord told him. And as Elijah stood there, the Lord what? Come on, the Lord passed by. God says to Elijah, go out on this mountain, I will reveal myself to you. And when that happens, it says the Lord passed by. So one more from the book of Job. We don't know when this took place, but in the book of Job, kind of the main character, he's talking. And in Job chapter 9, this is what Job says about God. Verse 8 says, he, God alone, stretches out the heaven and treads or walks on the waves of the sea. Job says, God alone walks on or treads the waves of the sea. And then verse 11, Job says, when he, God, what does it say? Passes me, I cannot see him. When he goes by, I cannot perceive. So again, here's the deal. All these stories may or may not be that familiar to us, but for the disciples who are kind of hanging out with Jesus, the disciples that we're about to read about in this story, they, as good Jewish young boys, they were familiar with all of these stories. And so for a good Jewish boy or girl in this day, part of your understanding of God and who God is that first, when God is asked his name, he says, I am. So I am is God's revelation of his name to people. You know, as a good Jewish boy or girl, that when God chooses to reveal his physical presence to people, he passes by people so that they can get a glimpse of his glory, but without being fully destroyed. And we know from Job that God is the only one who treads on or who walks on water. Okay, so for a Jewish boy or girl living in the day of Jesus, that would be a big part of the framework of their understanding of God. So with that, Mark chapter 6, pick it up in verse 45. It says, immediately after this, we'll catch you up in a second if you're not sure what that is. Immediately after this, Jesus insisted that his disciples get back into the boat and head across the lake to Bethsaida, while he sent the people home. After telling everyone goodbye, he went up to the hills by himself to pray. So if you're not here last week, right before this, we looked at the story of Jesus miraculously feeding up to about 20,000 people. He fed them miraculously with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. If you missed that, you can check it out on YouTube and catch up and see what that's all about. But what's going on is this story we're about to look at happens right after that. It says immediately after this, so immediately after the feeding of this great crowd, it says Jesus insists. He doesn't suggest. He doesn't say, hey, this would be a good idea. Jesus insists that his disciples get in the boat and leave the place where they are. And then he takes off into the mountains to be by himself to pray. Now, Mark's gospel doesn't give us the details of why Jesus is so insistent of them kind of peacing out and getting out of there so quickly, but John's gospel actually gives us the details of what is going on here. So John chapter 6, verse 14, this is what it says after the feeding of the crowds. It says, when the people saw him, talking about Jesus, do this miracle, they exclaimed, surely he is the prophet we have been expecting. Surely he's the prophet we've been expecting. When Jesus saw, listen to this, when Jesus saw they were ready to force him to be their king, he slipped away by himself. When Jesus saw they were ready to force him to be their king, he slipped away by himself. So after Jesus does this miracle where he feeds the crowd's like, hey, that was pretty cool. Like, we've never seen anything like that before. That was awesome. And so they say, hey, let's make Jesus our king. What they're doing is they are wanting to turn Jesus into a political revolutionary who will lead them to march against Rome, to drive the Romans out of their land and buy them political freedom. Right? That's what they want Jesus to be. That's what they're talking about when it says, let's force him to be our king. They want Jesus to be this political revolutionary. And so what's happening is the crowd wants a Jesus of their own making. They want a Jesus of their own understanding. They see the miracle of Jesus multiplying the bread and the loaves, or the bread and the fish, and it doesn't cause them to step back and say, man, that was amazing. There's something different about this guy. Okay, Jesus, we're ready. Our hearts are open to you. Tell us who you are, and whoever you are, we want to follow you. That's not what they do. Instead, they say, man, that was awesome. That was cool. All right, Jesus, now you're going to be who we want you to be. You're going to be our political king. And Jesus, at that, he says, nope, party's over. You're not going to tell me who I am. He says, boys, get in the boat. We're gone. We're getting out of here. Right? Jesus wants no part in being told who or what he will be. He said it's not up to the crowds who he's going to be. He's not going to form himself into the image that they want him to be. What we see as we continue reading Mark is that, yes, Jesus came to be not just a king, but he came to be the King of Kings. He didn't come to be a revolutionary who would just rule over the government of Rome for a couple decades. He came to be a king, whereas Isaiah says all governments will eventually rest on his shoulders for all eternity. That's who he came to be. But here's what Jesus knows. Jesus knows the cross has to come before the crown. The cross is coming before the crown. But the crowds aren't interested in any of that. They're not interested in learning who Jesus came to be. They just say, hey, this is awesome. Maybe this is the dude who can free us from Rome, who can lower our taxes, who can, get all these nasty Gentile Roman soldiers out of our land. Let's make him that. And Jesus says, nope, not happening. I am who I am, and you don't get to say who I am. See, we need to be really careful today that we don't assume all of our preferences onto Jesus. Right, that we don't try to make a Jesus into our own image. And here's the reality. This happens to me. This happens to all of us. Whenever, like, it gets to a point where Jesus thinks just like we think, Jesus likes all the same things we like, he dislikes all the things we dislike, and Jesus is just like us, and we're probably in that danger zone of making Jesus into our own image. Because Jesus is who he is, and we don't have a saying that he reveals himself, and our only choice is to accept or reject who he says he is. So we'll get to that in a second. But the crowds here, again, they just want Jesus to be this political revolutionary king. So let's make him our king. And Jesus says, nope, that's not who I am. That's not what I came to do. That's not who I came to be. So I'm out of here. And so next, he's going to show his disciples, he's going to give his disciples a glimpse of who he truly is. Not who people want him to be, but who he truly is. So it goes on in verse 47. So again, the disciples are in the boat. Jesus is up on the mountain praying by himself. It says, late that night, the disciples were in the boat in the middle of the lake, and Jesus was alone on land. He saw that they were in serious trouble, rowing hard and struggling against the wind and the waves. About 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came toward them walking on water. He intended to go past them. What was that? He intended to go past them. But when they saw him walking on water, they cried out in terror, thinking it was a ghost. They were all terrified when they saw him. But Jesus spoke to them at once. Don't be afraid, he said. Take courage. I am here. Then he climbed into the boat, and the wind stopped, and they were totally amazed, for they still didn't understand the significance of the miracle of the loaves, because their hearts were too hard to take it in. So again, really at its core, this entire story is about Jesus showing his disciples, and then thus showing us today his true identity and who he is. Okay, so notice all those connections, or all those hyperlinks, if you will, back to the Old Testament. Right, so here in Mark 6, the disciples, they're in the middle of the sea, they're struggling at night, and Jesus comes to them walking on the water. I remember Job 9 said, only God treads on the waves. Only God walks on the waves. Or what about, it says here that Jesus came walking on the water and he intended to go past them. Like, what's going on with that? Because if you just read that there, it sounds like Jesus is kind of being a jerk, right? Like, they're in the middle of the sea, the wind is strong, they've been rowing all night, they're not moving, they're not going anywhere because of the wind, and it sounds like Jesus just comes kind of walking on the water like, hey guys, stinks for you, you can't walk on water too, like, I'll see you at the other side when you eventually get there. It seems like he's just kind of, picking on them. But that's not what's happening at all. Right? Remember those Old Testament stories. Every time, in those stories, every time where God chose to reveal himself to people, every time it said that he passed them by. When God reveals himself to humanity in the Old Testament, he passes them by. That language is used to refer to God revealing himself. Moses, hide under the rock, and I'll pass you by. Elijah, go up on the mountain, and I'll pass you by. Job says, when you pass me by. This language of passing by biblically directly is tied to the revelation of God. And so it says, Jesus came walking on water. He intended to pass them by. And then finally it says, when this happens, the disciples see him. They're terrified. They think it's a ghost. I can't blame them. I probably would too. But Jesus speaks to them, and Jesus says, don't be afraid. Take courage. I am here. Now, here's the deal. In our English Bibles, it says, I am here, because otherwise it'd be clunky English. But in the Greek, what Jesus actually says is the word here is not even there. In the original language, what Jesus actually says is, do not fear, I am. That's what Jesus says to his disciples. So back 1,400 years before this, when God spoke to Moses through the burning bush, and Moses said, God, what is your name? God says, I am. Here they think Jesus is a ghost. And Jesus says, no, don't be afraid. I'm no ghost. I am. What this story of Jesus walking on water, what this story is ultimately teaching his disciples, and through it, what he's ultimately teaching us, is this story is showing us that Jesus is actually God. That he is that God who spoke to Moses 1,400 years earlier through the burning bush. He is the God who revealed himself to Moses up on that mountain. He is the God who revealed himself to Elijah up on that mountain. He is the God that Job talks about, that only he can walk on water. Jesus is showing us here that he's not some prophet, he's not some teacher, he's not some miracle worker. Yes, he does all those things, but those things are not his identity. He's showing us that his identity is God. He is God. Listen, this is what sets Christianity apart from every other faith system, every other philosophy on the planet. Because here's the deal. Pretty much everyone agrees that Jesus of Nazareth was a real man who lived about 2,000 years ago in the Middle East and caused a big ruckus, right? Like, you know, other religions don't deny that. Secular scholars don't deny that. We have as much evidence that Jesus was a real person as we do that Julius Caesar was a real person. Like, everybody knows Jesus of Nazareth was a real human being who really lived in space and time a couple thousand years ago. No one disagrees with that, or no one really actually disagrees with that looking at the evidence. However, what sets us apart, what sets Christianity apart from everything else, is we actually believe that that man who lived in the Middle East 2,000 years ago is actually God with skin and bone on. Right? That's what we believe about Jesus. And so here's the deal. This is why just a few minutes ago, that's why we sing, "You have no rival, you have no equal, now and forever, God, you reign." What a beautiful name it is, the name of Jesus, right? We don't come here on Sunday mornings and sing that to Paul. We don't come here on Sunday mornings and sing that to Mary. We don't sing that to Moses. We don't sing that to David. All great people who God used to do amazing things, but none of those people are God. But Jesus is God. But here's the beautiful part that the story really shows us, and this is even better. Not only is this showing us that Jesus is God, this is showing us that Jesus is God who draws near to us with his presence. He's not a distant God. He's not a foreign God. He's not the God of deism like many of America's founding fathers believe, where, you know, you believe that God created the world, but then after he created it, he just kind of checked out like an absentee father and left us on our own. This is showing us that Jesus is not that God. He's not an absentee father who created everything and then left us on our own. He's a God who draws near to us. See, in those Old Testament stories we looked at, man, it's not that God was distant, because God was never distant. God was always near his people. It's just that in some ways, at that time, God had not fully revealed himself. He was not fully knowable. Right? Like in the New Testament, the language that the New Testament uses, that God is a personal father to us. That language is never used for individuals in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, an individual would never say, "God is my father," because God is not that personal in their understanding. Right, so when Moses wants to see God's glory, he can't fully see it. God says, I'll just give you a glimpse of it, because if you fully see it, you're going to die. So he just gets a glimpse as God passes by. But through Jesus, what happens now in Mark 6 is Jesus, the Son of God, puts on skin and bone. He enters humanity, fully human, fully divine. As Sisto read earlier, all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell in the person of Jesus. Think about that. Not like 10% of God, not 50%, not even 99.99% of God dwelled in Jesus. All of God's fullness was fully dwelling in Jesus. But the person of Jesus, when God, here in Mark 6, is passing by, again, when he is revealing himself to his followers, he passes by, he shows them a glimpse. But then he doesn't just keep going. It says, and then he climbed into the boat with them. Through Jesus, the God of the universe draws near to his people. Now, we'll close with this, and then we're going to sing and we're going to worship Jesus together as our God and as our King. But just as back in the Old Testament, in Exodus 33, that's where we looked at earlier, when Moses comes to God and Moses says, "God, will you show me your glory?" I think sometimes we are tempted to think things like, "Oh man, like, could you imagine being Moses? Like, that would have been awesome." We think, man, like I would have killed to have lived back then. Oh, what kind of faith I would have had if I could have seen the burning bush. Man, that would have been incredible. What kind of faith I would have if, God hid me under the rock and then I caught a glimpse of his glorious past by. Man, if I could see the things that Moses saw, that would be amazing. Here's the deal. If Moses was here today and he could talk to you, he would tell you that, man, he would kill to see the things that we have seen. Because here's the deal. We have seen the story of Jesus. We have seen God become human. All the fullness of God pleased to dwell in Jesus. We've seen Jesus living and dying and rising from death. Moses would say, I just saw a glimpse of the back of God, but through Jesus, you get to see the fullness of the glory of God. And so here's the deal. So we're walking through life. If we ever, whatever we're going through, if we ever stop, and we think and we wonder and we say, man, what is God like? Or what does God think about? Or how would God respond to me with this? All we have to do is look at Jesus. If you want to know what God is like, just look at Jesus. The fullness of God dwelling in Jesus. If you're going through life and you think, man, what does God think when I'm anxious? What is God's response to my anxiety? Well, Jesus says, come to me, all of you who are weary, all of you who are heavy burdened, all of you who are anxious, just come to me and I'll give rest for your souls. We see in Jesus that God is a God who wants to give you peace in your anxiety. When you're going through something where you're scared, you don't know what the outcome's going to be, you feel like it's spiraling and things are just out of your control. How does God view that? What is God's response to that? Well, we'll look here at this story. When the disciples are rowing, they're alone in the middle of the night. Jesus comes to them and says, don't be afraid. Take courage. I am here. We see in Jesus that God is a God who, when we're afraid, when we feel like things are slipping out of our control, when we don't know what to do, he's a God who wants to walk with us. He wants to give us his presence in those seasons. Or what do you do in those seasons where maybe our faith is weak and we feel like we're just barely clinging to our faith? How does God respond to that? Does he get angry? Is he disappointed? He's saying, these fools, they can't even have stronger faith. What's wrong with them? No, look at Jesus. I love the thing here. Let me go. Let's see. Verse 52. The disciples, it says, they still didn't understand the significance of the miracle of the loaves because their hearts were too hard to take in. Man, here's the disciples. They've been with Jesus for a while now. They've seen Jesus do miracles. They've seen all of these things, and their faith still sucks. They still don't get it. Man, it says their hearts are still too hard to believe and understand. And how does Jesus react? Patiently, compassionately, gently. He still shows up and climbs in the boat with them. Maybe most importantly, what about when we sin, when we blow it, when we fail? How does God respond to that? What does God think about us? Well, look at how merciful Jesus is. That he, as God, he would lay down his divinity. He would become human to take our place, to live a perfect life, to die on the cross, to pay for our sin, to rise from death, so that God's mercy and grace could be poured out onto everyone who believes. That's how God responds to sinners. And so here's our response today. Trust in Jesus as God. Listen, here's our invitation for you. If you're here and maybe you're new with us, or even if you've been coming for a while, I'm sure there's some of you in this room who the reason you've been coming is because you've been maybe on this journey where you've been trying to explore for yourself who Jesus is. Maybe you've been fascinated with Jesus. You've been interested by this person of Jesus, and you've just been on this journey exploring, okay, is there something more? Like, okay, I see these stories, he does some incredible things, there's probably something there, but is there more to it than that? If that's you, and you've been on that journey trying to figure out who Jesus is, the invitation for you today is to trust and believe that Jesus is God. surrender your life to him, fall at his feet, and worship Jesus as your king. Because he's not only God, he is that, but he's the God who, when we were lost and headed to hell, he left heaven, he came down, he lived, he died, and he rose so that we could live forever with him. That's who Jesus is. And so if you haven't trusted in him, if you haven't believed in him yet, but he's opening your heart to that, don't leave here today without putting your faith in him. Let me pray for us.